those of you who know Maryland Civil War history, it was sort of, it was on the Union side officially, but not entirely on the, in terms of on the ground. So I guess I thought when I was invited to do a salon here, I don't know, I mean, in some ways I just thought, well, what's the thing that we all really need most to talk about right now in terms of the arts? And I felt like this was important to talk about. So I shared, I don't want to say too much because I hope you all have some thoughts. I do have, because I'm an art historian, I do have some pictures I brought with me, but I'm not going to, share my screen and all that. I might bring them up if I think it will help our conversation. But I encourage you all to read those 2 or 3 statements for a couple of reasons. The Society of Architectural Historians statement, I think so far is one of the most cogent and sort of precise and concise explanations of articulations of the position that Confederate monuments should be removed. And then the 2 executive orders I thought are important to know because they are coming from the White House and from the executive branch. And also because the one that you all got sort of that was added in today of sort of proposing the building of a new monument park articulated what we might call the little c conservative viewpoint of what it is a monument does. So it had, and in the preamble, it had some explanations. This is why we build monuments. This is what they're supposed to do. And so I think one of the things I guess I would encourage you all sort of as a question to sort of toss out there, because I think this is at the core of a lot of these conversations, is thinking about precisely what it is that a monument or memorial is supposed to do. What do we expect if a work of art is supposed to accomplish something, and especially a public work of art is supposed to express something or say something or cause its audience, its beholders to think about something or do something. What do memorials and monuments do? And then maybe we can say a little bit, we can talk a little about what it is that specifically memorials or monuments from the of Confederates figures do in those communities. So I don't know if any of you, if you want to sort of start with either what was in the statement from the architectural historians or from the White House, or just sort of off, from your own experiences. Why do we have monuments and memorials in our towns? Why do people feel like it's important to build them and to maintain them, do you all think?
I think they want to recognize an historical event, but the thing that has always been amazing to me is, these Confederate monuments, in addition to the white supremacy, these people were treasonous. The war was treason. And so why are we having monuments to that? And and I realize they were built, after the fact of the war, but even so, why glorify that?
Well, so Elizabeth, I agree. And I think that in the first place, when you think about monuments, think about graveyards. Why do we put gravestones? We want to remember, and yet to have a remembrance of people who were treasonous seems inappropriate to our country. And so it seems to me that then gives you the bottom line for deciding that these monuments should go.
And it's, I think, this happened, so you can, I don't know if you recognition of what happened, but a monument to me implies you're saluting the person, so why would you have that?
So there's a sort of honorific, it's not just memory, but there's a sort of sense of honor, maybe encouraging people who look at it to look on it with esteem. I think it's important that they're often on pedestals, so you literally have to look up to the figure, right? Which I think also then has its figurative connotation that you should look up to them. I might, because this is what I like to do as a teacher, and just mom will tell you, actually, I'm just, this is my personality. I'm a little bit ornery. I might ask some questions that maybe will run a little bit counter, but just to sort of keep us moving along. There's a great story in the late 19th century. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire hired some Italian architects to work on the building Hagia Sophia, known as Hagia Sophia, which at the time was a mosque. It's now a museum, although apparently it's going to be turned back into a mosque. But of course, it was originally built as a church, as the greatest church in Christendom, in the city of Constantinople, now Istanbul, as you all know from the song. These architectural, sort of restorers were working in the building and suddenly realized that there were some mosaics of the Virgin Mary, of Christ, and of Byzantine empires, of John the Baptist, on the walls that had been plastered over and whitewashed over in Hagia Sophia. And they went to the Sultan and asked him what he should do with them, knowing that the Ottoman Empire had very strict rules about having images in mosques. They were not comfortable with any images in mosques. And so I think kind of expecting that they were going to have to, the Sultan was going to say to destroy them. And the Sultan said, it's not for me to decide what the future of this building is. Only Allah knows that. So I'm not going to tear these out. Just cover them over the plaster and preserve them again. And in the future, someone may wish to uncover them again. So he actually took a sort of preservationist stance, even though these were images of holy figures. And of course, remember that Jesus and Mary are holy to Muslims as well. And so, which is, again, very much against the teachings of the Sunni Islam that the Ottomans practiced. But he said, this isn't even though I don't want to see them, and even though I would never want them to be made, it isn't for me to decide that these should be destroyed. Is there perhaps a similar approach that we should take here? Is there some sort of humility that we should follow there, saying, oh no, maybe we shouldn't just decide for ourselves that these monuments should come down? Or are we all confident enough? Or is there some other explanation to say, no, this is why these should come down and not just be covered over in place, or some other kind of hiding of them?
Ben, I would just say the monuments, in my view, are teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's useful sometimes to say, oh my goodness, who was this Farragut? I mean, the guy who's got the park in Washington named after him.
Mm-hmm.
Who is he? What did he do? Why did he do it? What did he live? So they mark a point or a personage in history that teaches others, and for better or for worse. I mean, sometimes the lessons are pretty grim. Like I worked for 3 years in Hungary at a time when everybody was pulling down the statues of Lenin and Stalin,
Mm-hmm.
and they were about to destroy them all until the government said, well, we're going to make a park. We're going to put all these horrible people together in a park, and they can talk to each other through these to themselves out there in the country. And it'll be teaching. It'll be a teacher for people to come and remember the horrible things that those people did. So there's that aspect too.
Yeah. So what do you all think? Because that's one of the things that people have suggested is sort of having a kind of Confederate monument dumping ground in a way, or a park that puts them aside somewhere doesn't destroy them, but removes them from that sort of the civic, the squares and town centers and things like that, and puts them somewhere else where people, if they want to go reflect on that, can do that. Or it serves as a kind of artistic exile, right? You've been removed, you've been taken away.
More history.
Solution?
I think that's important. You know, it's history. It happened. So to talk about it, you have a visual, and to talk about what they did is important. I mean, even, you know, for example, in Europe, where they will have stepping stones outside of different buildings that will mark, you know, here was murdered so-and-so by the Nazis, or, you know, things. And I mean, these things happened.
Mm-hmm.
I always think about audience, and I think that's one of the pieces of context that sometimes it's hard to kind of put in the right place in this conversation. I mean, I think in a public monument, you don't know necessarily who the audience is. If they were in a park, it would be a little more self-selecting, maybe. There might be field trips, I guess, but it would be the people who wanted to go there for, I could imagine, various reasons. You know, I think one of the problems is that when it is in the middle of the town square and on a pedestal and has a big fancy looking plaque on it, you know, your audience is not necessarily clued into the context, and it has a way of elevating, even if you read the plaque and it said, you know, terrible things. I think in general it has a way of just elevating that whoever the person or the event is to a status that maybe we don't really want it to have, because the audience is whoever's walking by and thinking about their grocery list, instead of someone who's coming to a park for the specific reason of understanding. On the other hand, if there was a park like that, who's going to go to it? That worries me a little.
That's what I was wondering too. Yeah, who's the audience for that park? And are we self-selecting for things that I'm not sure I want to be self-selecting for, that they're going to pay money or just show up and do field trips with kids and indoctrinate them about something related to that park? That seems strange, but I do think it's better than having them in the town square. One of the articles that I read, you know, perhaps just on my own, like there was a statue of either Stalin or Lenin, and then some other artist had done a big box basically made out of mesh with all, so it's one of those that we've seen with all the heads in it, and it was just heads of, you know, a couple hundred people that represented the thousands that Stalin or Lenin was responsible for killing. And the person who made that said, okay, you can have this, but it has to go next to the Stalin of Lenin or Stalin in that park. And I mean, I like that, but I still am not quite sure that I need the first one. So I wasn't sure.
Well, the thing about statues in public places too is that it implies public approval or governmental approval of that person or that event. And so I think that's one reason that we should probably move them to some other place. I'm not in favor of destroying them as in such a knee-jerk way. I think process is really important in this situation. We can't just have people thinking it's okay to splash paint on the St. Gaudens Memorial in Boston, or you know, without there's a lot of evidence of historical lack of knowledge in all of this too. And so I think my preference would be to move them, but I'm not quite sure. I wouldn't be in favor of destroying everything for certain. That wouldn't make sense. Although some of them aren't works of art.
No.
Okay. So I'd like to open that up. I mean, what do you all think of, I have to call her Mom because it feels weird to call her Margot. What do you think of Mom's claim that not every statue is a work of art, or not every monument or memorial is a work of art? And so, and that, I think, because that's one thing that in our society, we have this tendency to think that all works of art should be cared for, should be treated carefully, should be preserved, especially works of art that are of a certain age. And the first thing I would say is that that's actually, that's an unusual quality of our culture, historically speaking. The modern Western sense of preserving works of art is actually a historical anomaly. But if maybe we start to declare, oh, these things are not really works of art, rather they're propaganda, or they're architectural decoration or something like that, and not fully a work of art, does that maybe loosen up the conversation a little bit so people are sort of maybe more comfortable with removing them or perhaps melting them down? Do you all worry about starting to, create a precedence for taking things down and saying, oh, declaring that's not actually art, so we can do whatever we want with it?
Well, there's an interesting
It's not art because it's not good art, or it's simply not art. Because I think most people would consider them art, but some of them are just bad. So do we keep the ones we consider good art and put them off someplace and melt down the others, or?
That's one option, to say these ones are worth keeping as representative samples, and as sort of the best examples of this tradition of Confederate monument building, which happened in our culture. Michael, you were about to say something, I thought.
So there's an interesting example in the neighborhood where I have a house in Capitol Hill, which is in Lincoln Park, and that's an Emancipation statue, which was done by a fairly well-known Italian artist, sculptor by the name of George Ball. And it was actually fabricated in Germany and brought over. And it's probably one of the earliest statues to Lincoln in the country. It was paid for with funds raised by African Americans in their first wages once they were liberated from slavery. And it was given in gratitude for Lincoln emancipating them. It was dedicated by Frederick Douglass 11 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And people, it's not so much good art or bad art, it's that it's racist art now, because Lincoln is towering over the slave is actually based on a real slave who has been emancipated, and he's looking up at Lincoln and the shackles have been removed. So now people say, this doesn't show the Black person being an active party in his own or her own liberation. It's condescending. It reinforces old stereotypes of white supremacy. Yet this was a monument that was, it's not a Confederate monument, but still a monument that people now have been protesting regularly, and to the point where there are concrete barricades and a 8-foot tall fence around the monument to prevent it from being toppled. So I think it's more, there's more gray than just good art, bad art. What does the art represent say about the time in which it was built and how things were looked upon in that at that time? And changing aesthetics doesn't necessarily mean that the art itself is inferior, because every art reflects perhaps the values and aesthetics of its generation. And that, I think that statue was done in about 150 years ago.
I think you raise a very important point, and that's the point of time. Who's to judge? That's the slippery slope, I think. To me, it's clear that when we're talking about Lenin and Stalin, but it's not so clear if I'm a Muslim cleric, and I suddenly discover the mosaics with Christ and Mary, and erasing time, imposing time on monuments that capture something in time that is not your time, I think is very tricky and is a slippery slope.
So what they did with the Emancipation statue, it used to face the U.S. Capitol, and then they, on the other side of Lincoln Park, put up a statue to Mary Bethune, who was the founder of the National Association of, I think it was Colored Women, I think was
Women.
what it was called
Women
originally. Women of color.
People.
Yeah, and by the two characters, a black female who was a daughter of sharecroppers who ran this influential organization and was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt and actually held a position in the Roosevelt administration, and then Lincoln, the two facing each other. I think they were trying to show across time a progress, among the African American experience. So that's another part of the discussion, is how different monuments placed near each other may interact. And one of the solutions that people have proposed to this current hubbub about the Emancipation statue is that we should have another statue of Frederick Douglass, who dedicated it, who was a great, black abolitionist, who was not particularly a big fan of Abraham Lincoln, who called him repeatedly in the dedication speech that he was the white man's president, and, have some kind of interpretive exhibit that puts it all into context. I think a lot of passions have been inflamed during the recent murders, particularly, Floyd, and somebody had said before that people don't necessarily appreciate the history of what's going on. They're seizing the passions of the moment. So I hope that doesn't happen in a way that is irreparable later on. I mean, like when they put Christopher Columbus, the statue, he's not Confederate, into the Baltimore Harbor a couple weeks ago. I didn't think that was necessarily a good move.
I think one of the important things is when Michael was talking about the context of the Emancipation statue, of, that it was paid for by freed slaves. This was something important to them. They were honoring Lincoln. So many of the Confederate statues were put up as a way of reinforcing Jim Crow laws and, letting blacks know we're the master. And so I'm not one for just destroying statues. I really don't. I do think that removing those Confederate statues from town centers, places like that, and putting them in a place, either in a museum or someplace where you can get they can be used to teach what was wrong with what happened. Because what they do now is honor the Confederacy and honor people who were fighting to keep slavery. And I don't think that's something we should be honoring in this country.
My problem with a lot of this discussion is that the statues and the Confederate flag obviously symbolize something that has never been resolved in this society, in our country. It's unresolved. Eliminating the statues, particularly if it's perceived as outsiders come in and eliminate the statues, is not going to help it. I'm not necessarily saying the statues need to stay there, but if you take a look at what the statues and the Confederate flag now symbolize, they are big in Minnesota and Wisconsin. The Confederate flag is big in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and that has nothing to do with slavery. So you need to think about what this has come to symbolize now. and what are the unresolved issues that we need to address. Because it's not, yes, it is slavery, yes, the statues were put up for that, but at this point, what does this represent to the modern society?
A teaching moment.
I think.
I mean,
And I think,
Go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, I think that's a really good point that kind of ties in with Colleen's point about, you know, the origin of some of these Confederate monuments, that really wasn't, it was propaganda, and it was a scare tactic. And so that's sort of I'm thinking about the history as something that's still happening, and I'm thinking about, you know, it's a little bit heterodox to think about altering works of art that are existing, but to me, that's one way possibly to provide context, or to acknowledge where we are now in the kind of passage of time and the passage of history from what they are sort of purported to honor or commemorate to when they were really put up and for what reasons to where we are now.
so again,
Because I think Pam's right. They don't mean what they meant at the time, and they also don't mean what they were purported to mean at the time that they were erected.
and again, getting back to imposing ideas. And, you know, we all agree that the Confederate statues originally were put up well after the Civil War to impose a set of values and as a way of, you know, Jim Crow, to promote and support Jim Crow laws. But who is going to make the decision to take down the statues now? Who's going to impose that? I mean, is that going to be people who don't live in the South, who come in and say, you must remove these statues because they're evil? Or do you wait for things to change enough for the you know, a community to say, we have got to move this statue. It's important to us, but it's not as important as, it's not important enough to be in the town center. I think
So
that's
you
a
could,
question.
you could make, Pam, you could make those decisions ideally on a community by community basis.
Exactly.
But there are going to be communities that make decisions that we don't really like then.
Exactly, you know?
So, but the other point is, they're coming down right now. I mean, what do we do right now while things are being thrown into creeks and you know, this country doesn't do nuance very well, so we're being dramatic.
Oh, Martha.
And you know that statues are just part of the issue here. If you look at the names for American military bases, there's Fort Bragg, there's Fort Meade. I mean, there's dozens of US military installations who are named for Confederate war heroes. So how do African Americans feel being in the military station there? And what role does the federal
Not to
government
mention
have?
schools.
Schools, highways. So, you know, we're talking about statues, and I know that it's veering away a little bit from, you know, the architecture art value, but it's a more pervasive issue than just statuary.
Well, I think what statues do really effectively is demarcate a space as a certain kind of space, and or a town even as a certain kind of town. They are concrete, visible, lasting declarations of the values of a town. And so the way that people move through that space can be very different. And one of the things I keep coming back to as I think about all this is my experience when I worked at the Walters in Boston. I used to like to have lunch at in the park, in Mount Vernon Square Park, right under the Washington Monument there in the city. If you don't know, if you haven't been in the Walters and you don't know what I'm talking about, shame on you. You should go to the Walters. But I was heading out to lunch one day and I saw a friend of mine who worked in the museum, Will, who was African-American, and he was going to lunch. I said, hey, do you want to come sit in the park and have lunch with me? And he said, no, I don't sit in that park. And I said, oh, why not? And he said, they used to sell slaves there. And I'm not comfortable just sitting and having lunch in a place where they used to sell slaves. And I had no idea. And one of the things that I think about is that the very different geography that white Americans, that Black Americans, that, you know, Latinx Americans, you know, all sorts of different, you know, people have and experience in their communities. So yeah, I mean, I think to Michael's point that, yeah, the state parks and the streets and the military bases, all those things that are named for Confederate figures, it's a little bit far afield from talking about public art in this case, but it is of a piece. It's all, you know, it is all about the spaces and how we define them.
So Ben, if I could add something to your story, one reason he may not have wanted to be in that park is that there was a monument to Tane the Justice, who ruled in the Dred Scott decision. And what's interesting is that that statue in Mount Vernon Square is situated right outside of Mr. Walter's townhouse. Mm-hmm. So he could see that. And it was slaves often, or poorly paid Black laborers, who constructed, you know, a lot of his railroads that allowed for that tremendous art collection that everybody enjoys today. Yep. So that's another context too.
Yeah.
But that brings up the point about teaching, which I think, Michael, you mentioned earlier. Shame on us if we don't learn the lessons that are present in the statues and in the places and throughout our history that just tell us that wonderful things and terrible things have happened, and our ancestors not so long ago perpetuated them. And that to me is what this debate is about. It's not just about a statue or the names of the military bases, which I think is very important to take a look at, or whether or not, I have to tell you something that's very painful for me to say, but the flag at Heron Point was not at half-mast, and I could not believe it. So I wrote the executive director and said, what is this? I was shocked, and I wrote him on Sunday night, and John Lewis, of course, died on Friday, and he too was shocked. And then nothing was changed the day after or this morning. And there are things like this that are teaching moments that I think if we just stay silent, or if we destroy a monument without knowing the context, then we're losing the chance really to come to terms with what has happened and what we're perpetuating or not perpetuating. So I look at these monuments and names as teaching opportunities, and let's get on with it.
So maybe some of these monuments, you know, because I do think when you look at some of the monuments, because they're elevated and they're sculpted, and oftentimes they're on horses and they look commanding, you think this is a person to be celebrated. And oftentimes the wording gives no indication whatsoever of why they should not be celebrated. So, I mean, what about the idea of leaving some of these monuments up and have scathing, if not, you know, more accurate descriptions of all the bad things they did as a teaching tool?
One thing I think about, I have two different thoughts that I kind of want to make quick. One is, if you all didn't see it, I put into the chat a link to an image of that Lincoln Monument Memorial, so that if you weren't familiar with it, you could see it. I think that this, in some ways, I think that that is one of the most helpful examples for us to think about, because the history of it tells one story, and the visual imagery of it, the visual rhetoric of it tells a different story. And I think we can all recognize the importance of the fact that it was built and dedicated by African Americans, but I think we could also all recognize why now the visual imagery of it, the visual rhetoric of it, what it teaches as a statue is not something that most people would, that I would say right-thinking people would be comfortable with. And so then the question is, how do we, I think it puts these two things in tension in a way that actually can help us start to think through, okay, so what is important to keep, what is important to recognize, how do you balance that? Go ahead.
Any kind of art, different people interpret it differently. And the one news piece I saw on that particular statue, they were showing a younger Black woman arguing with an older Black woman about why it should go and why it should stay.
Mm-hmm.
And the one person was saying, this man was on his knees because he was a slave in chains. Now those chains are broken. He's going to get up. He's going to,
Yep. Yeah.
But again, it's just more interpretation is important. I would, some of those statues currently were destroyed, I believe, because of the understandable frustration of what's going on. But I would venture to say some people didn't know, how much do they know about that statue?
Yeah.
But there's evident ignorance. Yeah. And then one other thing I wanted to sort of highlight or point out is the opportunity cost of leaving these statues up, even if we rededicate them, even if we recontextualize them. There's still essentially valuable real estate that could be given over to something that more fully and richly reflects what the present community wants to think about and see. It's also, for me, it's the problem I have with a lot of times you hear people say, well, we should put them in a museum. And those things are huge. They're expensive to maintain. I mean, a museum, when it takes something in, makes a promise that it will maintain that thing in perpetuity, which means preserving it, which means storing it somewhere. That's a lot of cubic footage. And any registrar or curator who works in a museum will say that they have a cost. They know how much it costs per square inch to store a work of art for 10, 15, 20 years. And if we put those things into a museum, we are accepting the fact that we're not going to store other things in a museum. And so in both cases, one of the reasons why I am increasingly in favor of removal and destruction of most of these monuments is I don't see anything to be done with them that doesn't commit us to essentially continuing to preserve figures, continue to preserve statues, to monuments to people who most of us don't, consider to be traitors, much less, and also racist and all that.
How terrific would it be if we put them out like Lenin and Stalin, or those statues are out in the wild, and they're getting destroyed by the environment.
I mean, maybe they make a good oyster reef.
Well, so Ben,
Yeah.
I have a friend who suggested we just get rid of all the men on top and keep those beautiful horses.
How about putting them in relevant places like Antietam, Sharpsburg, Gettysburg, the ones that relate to those battles. There's important history.
That's a good idea.
There that we don't want to forget. They make a statement. That each statue, to me, they're more of a conversation and a reflection of our culture at the time than they are art. So that's just my 2 cents.
I wonder if we could spend a minute and talking about one of the attachments you sent, which was the National Garden that's proposed.
Yes.
Because in that, the current administration has named what they consider exemplary, illustrious Americans who should be in the garden of statuary. These include people like Anthony Scalia and a few other notables who, Billy Graham, who may be divisive figures in their own right. And okay, so federal funding goes to that. They wanted it by, I think, 2026. They're going to find a location, conceivably, on public land, federal land in Washington, D.C. And that's where, I guess, generate these people. And, what is future generations going to think about that? What happens when some of Scalia's rulings are unveiled to show just how much inequality those rulings harvested, let's say, in America? I thought that was, as we tear these things down, other things go up that I think are just going to be equally divisive.
Right. One thing I also found interesting in that list, that I was really fast. I sort of geeked out on that list for a little bit because I was fascinated by who they chose, and that whole executive order was a highly rhetorical document, right? It was an editorial just as much as it was an executive order, and I have to note also the irony that the NEA and the NEH are supposed to work on this, even though every year the White House tries to zero out the funding for the NEA and the NEH. But one of the things I noticed as I looked back over that list is that there are only white and Black Americans on that list. If you looked at that list, you would believe that there are only two races in this nation, and so you could come up with any number of important laudatory Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans,
Native Americans.
Native American, exactly right. We're missing from that list, but at the same time, they suggested putting up statues to Christopher Columbus and Junipero Serra, who is also a highly contentious figure in the Native American community. And so I think that one of the things that was funny about that document, and the other one is that when they talk about monuments coming down, they never actually talk about any of the Confederate monuments coming down. They just highlight the kind of frankly stupid stuff that some people have done, in Madison, Wisconsin, and in Boston. And then they make this list, and they very pointedly included abolitionists and civil rights advocates, and then lots of white American statesmen and stateswomen, but no one else. So the question of then, I think this gets us to something about monuments. When you choose who to put up in a monument, you're saying this is a crucial person for us to remember. This is a crucial person for us. That's the rhetoric of that document. We put up monuments, memorials to sort of say, assemble. These are the people through which we tell or think about our story as a nation. And that was sort of a first draft of it. But then when we look around all the other monuments, when we look around town, right? We've got George Vickers, we've got what's his name, the baseball player, Nicholson. We've got a mysterious woman that no one seems to know who it is, sitting down. We've got Hebe. It's interesting to sort of think about how Chestertown tells its story by the statues it's put up.
I am afraid that we are 5 minutes over already, and I know that Ben has to go teach a class in a little while here, and we always like to try to end as close to on time as we can so that you all want to come back next time. Ben Tilghman, thank you so much. This is really great. I hope you'll consider coming back for a part 2 sometime, because I think there's a lot more to be said about this, and also you have many other areas of expertise. We like to always end with a toast, and so I've been thinking, and I think what I've heard that I think we would maybe want to elevate to the level of a toast tonight is that teaching is important and context is important. And that what we want to do is make intentional choices instead of reactionary choices about who we honor and what we honor and how we do it. So I think I would like to toast to the idea of considered intentionality, which is something we don't have that much these days.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you,
Have a
Ben.
great night.
Thank you so much for the
Thanks,
conversation.
Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you for coming.
We
Thanks
will
for the
see you
great
next time.
conversation.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.